1871, East Texas. The cotton fields of Black Hollow stretch silent beneath the heavy summer heat, their white blooms catching what little moonlight filters through the restless sky. But beneath that stillness, something sinister lurks. Farmers spoke of the cries that rose at night, carried across the fields on the wind, until one morning the silence was broken by discovery. A young field worker, his body torn and left sprawled among the stalks, blood soaking into the soil that once promised harvest. It would be the first of many. In the blistering summer of 1871, Texas was a land divided between memory and change, scarred by the brutal weight of war that had ended just 6 years before. Reconstruction had stretched its long, uncertain shadow across the South, and in East Texas the wounds were rawer than most. The cotton fields still stood tall and white, rolling in neat rows across the landscape, but the men and women who bent to pick them were no longer enslaved, and that single fact alone altered everything. Where once overseers cracked their whips and landowners tallied their profits, now uneasy contracts and fragile agreements kept the system alive, though with none of the old certainty. Freedmen, proud but weary, signed their names to sharecropping papers they could barely read, clinging to the promise of ownership and independence that the law spoke of but reality denied. Poor whites, displaced soldiers and drifters from the collapsing Confederacy, mingled uneasily with them in the fields, all bound by hunger and desperation. And above them loomed the landowners, men who once commanded and now watched nervously, as their power slipped grain by grain through their hands. Texas in 1871 was not the grand frontier of dime novels, but a place of simmering tension. The railroads had not yet tamed the wilderness, and lawmen were few and often corrupt. Communities clustered in patches of cleared land, hemmed in by forests and swamps that seemed endless. Violence was common, feuds, robberies, lynchings, and beneath it all ran the unspoken truth. The old world of slavery was dead, but its ghost lingered, poisoning the present. Freed people walked with heads high in daylight, but slept lightly at night, never certain when a knock on the door might bring hooded riders or drunken neighbors seeking vengeance for imagined slights. For every promise of progress, there was a threat of retribution. The cotton itself became both salvation and curse. Its price dictated survival, and the soil of Texas, rich and stubborn, demanded sweat and sacrifice to yield its bounty. Families rose before the sun, trudged through rows that seemed endless, their fingers raw and backs bent until night fell. Cotton was money, cotton was survival, cotton was power. And yet for many it was also a reminder of chains that had only recently been broken. Freedmen worked the same fields they had once been bound to, and landowners watched their profits shrink while resenting every coin paid in wages. The fields carried not just crops but memory, and memory can weigh heavier than iron. It was in this charged landscape that the name Black Hollow emerged. A patch of land a few miles outside a modest East Texas settlement, the hollow was known for its fertile soil, its cotton tall and heavy laden compared to the thinner crops that grew elsewhere. The land had a strange reputation long before the killings began. Old settlers spoke of shadows that moved where no man walked, of nights when the fields seemed to hum as if the earth itself remembered what had been done upon it. During the war, deserters were said to have hidden in those fields, and stories of midnight hangings of bodies buried among the rows to vanish without trace passed from mouth to ear but were never written down. Children were warned not to stray near the hollow after dark, though no one could quite explain why. By 1871, the hollow had become a place of uneasy labor. Freed families worked the land under harsh conditions, their pay often measured in little more than scraps of food or small credit at the general store, debts piling year after year. Poor whites, stripped of their former pride, toiled alongside them, nursing bitterness not only at their poverty but at the sight of former slaves now standing as their equals, or in some cases, even their superiors. The hollow was not just a field. It was a crucible, pressing human lives together until resentment, envy, and rage boiled at the surface. The air was heavy with more than heat. It carried the sharp tang of distrust. The nights in Black Hollow carried their own menace. Lanterns flickered against the black sky, the only light breaking the wide, smothering darkness. Coyotes cried in the distance, owls called from the trees, and the rustle of cotton stalks in the wind often felt like whispers. Families huddled in small wooden cabins on the edges of the fields, doors barred, ears straining for footsteps that might or might not come. In such a world, rumor took root easily. A stranger on horseback passing through the settlement could spark a week of speculation. A lantern seen swaying in the hollow at midnight, whether from a worker late to return or something more, became the talk of the town by dawn. This was the climate of fear and unease in which the murders would soon unfold. It was a world already soaked in tension, where trust was scarce and survival often meant suspicion. The Civil War had left scars deeper than battlefields. It had left neighbors who no longer knew if they could rely on each other, communities fractured between old allegiances and new realities. Reconstruction's promise of justice and equality clashed violently with the persistence of hatred and hierarchy. And through it all, the hollow lay waiting, its fields white with cotton, its soil rich and dark, its history buried in layers of silence. To understand the horror that would erupt there, one must first see the stage as it stood in 1871, a Texas caught between past and future, clinging to a crop that both sustained and cursed it, populated by men and women who bore too much memory and too little hope. Black Hollow was more than geography. It was a symbol of all that could not be resolved. It was the silence of those who had suffered, the arrogance of those who still claimed ownership, and the restless hunger of a land unwilling to forget. In that silence, violence found its place, and from those cotton rows, the legend of blood in the fields was born. The first discovery came on a morning that should have been like any other. The sun had barely risen, and a thin veil of mist clung low across the cotton rows, turning the field into a ghostly sea of white. Workers moved slowly through the stalks, sacks slung over their shoulders, their feet dragging from the endless labor of the harvest season. But one man did not move. He lay crumpled between the rows, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles, the cotton around him stained with a deep, spreading darkness that was not dew. It was a young field hand, no more than 20, and his body bore wounds so deliberate, so vicious, that no one could mistake the act for accident or misfortune. His chest was marked with long, deep slashes, and his throat had been cut clean, leaving his eyes open and staring upward into the pale morning sky. The discovery spread like fire. Within an hour, the workers had abandoned their sacks, their voices sharp and panicked, some crying, some crossing themselves, some already whispering the word murder, as if saying it aloud might draw the killer's gaze. The landowner was summoned, and then the sheriff, a weary man who carried more suspicion than authority. He bent over the body, studying the wounds, and his face remained unreadable, though his silence unsettled the gathering crowd more than any words might have. The sheriff eventually muttered that it could have been bandits or drifters, men without scruples who haunted the countryside in those years. But even as he said it, those who looked closer saw signs that were harder to explain. Beside the body, in the churned soil of the field, someone had pressed a mark. It was triangular, sharp-edged and deep, as if hammered into the earth with an iron tool. No one present could say what it meant, but it was not the kind of mark left by wagon wheels or boots. Near it lay a small pool of spilled lantern oil, though no lantern was found. The sheriff dismissed it as coincidence, yet the workers exchanged uneasy looks. Lantern oil did not spill itself, and marks in the dirt did not appear by chance. Within days, another body was found. This time it was a woman, a sharecropper's wife who had failed to return from tending to the rows before sunset. They found her at dawn, her hands bound with coarse rope, her dress torn and muddied, her face struck so violently that her jaw had broken. Like the first victim, her throat had been cut, and again the strange triangular mark was stamped into the earth nearby. Families began to whisper that the killings were not random at all, but carried purpose, perhaps message, as though someone wanted the bodies not simply destroyed, but displayed. The blood in the cotton, they said, was meant to be seen. The hollow itself seemed to grow darker with each discovery. By late summer, workers spoke of hearing footsteps in the fields at night, the sound of cloth brushing against the cotton stalks when no one should have been there. Lanterns were spotted swaying far into the rows, moving steadily as though carried by unseen hands, only to vanish when approached. A farmer swore he saw two men bent over the field in the moonlight, digging with spades, but when he reached the spot, the earth was undisturbed, and no prints remained in the soil. Such accounts were passed from cabin to cabin, fueling the fear that spread faster than the sheriff could contain it. The landowners, anxious about their crops and furious over the disruption, pressured the sheriff to act, but what could he do? The killings seemed to leave no trail. No valuables were stolen, no livestock taken, no signs of struggle beyond the bodies themselves. It was as though the victims were chosen, carried into the fields, killed with precision, and left behind like warnings. Some residents began to claim it was not men at all but spirits, the restless dead of war or slavery, rising to haunt those who dared work the soil that had been watered with blood long before. Others insisted it was more human, the work of vigilantes or secret societies bent on keeping freedmen in their place, sending messages written not on paper, but in flesh. The killings did not stop. By September, 4 more bodies had been discovered, each marked by the same grim calling card: the lantern oil, the triangular impression, and the deliberate ritualistic cuts. Families began to abandon their fields, fleeing in wagons under cover of night, unwilling to risk another harvest. The cotton, once a symbol of profit, now stood as a reminder of danger, each white bloom like a shroud fluttering in the hot wind. The hollow fell eerily quiet, as though the land itself held its breath. For those who stayed, life became a series of fearful routines. Children were not allowed outside after sunset, and men took to guarding their cabins with rifles across their laps, though none ever fired a shot at whatever stalked the fields. The sounds continued. The crunch of footsteps, the sudden flare of light in the distance, the low moan of wind that seemed almost like voices calling names. The discovery of the bodies had changed the hollow forever. What had once been a place of hard labor and harsh survival became something darker, a stage where fear itself was harvested. Row by row, the sheriff, unable to provide answers, faced growing hostility from both freedmen and landowners alike. Some accused him of complicity, others of cowardice, but none could deny that with each body found, his power shrank. The town preacher gave fiery sermons, declaring the murders as judgment for sins unrepented, sins buried in the very soil that bore the cotton. He pointed to the triangular mark as a symbol of damnation, a sign that Satan himself had laid claim to the hollow. His words did little to comfort, but much to deepen the sense that something larger than mere crime was at work. In the minds of those who lived through that year, the first discovery in the mist of dawn remained etched deepest. The image of the young man sprawled in the rows, blood soaking into the soil, seemed to mark the end of whatever peace the hollow had once known. From that moment forward, every rustle in the stalks, every flicker of lantern light, carried the threat of violence. The cotton fields, once a place of toil, became a place of terror, and with each new discovery, the blood in the hollow seemed to speak louder, demanding attention, demanding remembrance, and above all, demanding fear. The killings did not seem like the random savagery of drifters, nor the sudden heat of passion that sometimes spilled into violence in Reconstruction Texas. They carried a shape, a rhythm, as though guided by an unseen hand with a cruel and deliberate intent. The first 2 victims had unsettled the community, but by the time the 3rd body was discovered, fear had begun to turn into something more sinister, suspicion that there was a pattern being followed, and that those chosen were not chosen by chance. People began to mark the similarities. Each death occurred in or near the cotton fields of Black Hollow, never in town or on the open road. Each carried the same grisly hallmarks: deep, almost ritualistic cuts across the chest, throats opened with precision, and that strange triangular mark pressed into the soil, stark against the churned earth. And then there was the lantern oil, spilled in puddles near every scene, as if a lamp had once burned there and then been carried away, leaving only its stain behind. To the men and women who worked the land, these signs were not dismissed as coincidence. In the cabins, whispers spread that the oil was meant as a beacon, a light in the darkness for whatever stalked the fields, or perhaps a signal, marking the place where blood had been spilled. The triangular impression became an obsession. Some claimed it resembled the blade of a planter's tool, a sign that the killer was one of their own. Others swore it matched the branding irons once used on livestock and men alike, a grotesque reminder of the slavery that had only recently ended. Yet others suggested it was not a tool at all but a symbol, belonging to some secret brotherhood or society that operated in shadows. The truth was no one knew, and in the vacuum of knowledge, rumor grew wild. By late summer, the murders seemed to obey an unsettling rhythm. Every few weeks, another body surfaced, each one left where it could not be missed, each one seeming less like a killing and more like a performance. Some of the victims were found in positions that suggested staging. A man was discovered kneeling, his head slumped forward as though forced into prayer before his execution. Another lay with arms outstretched, cotton stuffed into his open mouth. None of this fit the pattern of thieves or drunken outlaws. It was too careful, too deliberate. The bodies were not merely killed, they were displayed. This ritualistic aspect unsettled the Hollow more than anything else. For generations, violence had been a grim companion to life in Texas. Feuds, ambushes, and revenge killings were brutal, but predictable, rooted in grudges or greed. What haunted the people of 1871 was that these murders seemed to belong to another realm entirely. They were killings without explanation, as though the killer was not human at all but a force using the fields as a stage for a cruel message. Survivors told of hearing voices at night, low murmurs drifting across the rows. Some swore they saw lanterns bobbing in the darkness, moving with unnatural silence, their glow never revealing who carried them. There were even claims of figures, tall, shadowed forms walking slowly through the cotton, vanishing when approached, leaving behind only the marks in the dirt. Fear took root and grew in patterns as strong as the killings themselves. Freedmen suspected former Confederates of sending a warning, reminding them that freedom was fragile. White farmers whispered that the killings were vengeance from those they had once enslaved, a secret revolt carried out under the cover of night. Drifters passing through were eyed with hatred, while landowners themselves were accused of orchestrating the murders to tighten their grip over laborers. The killings became a mirror, reflecting the fault lines that had already fractured the community. Everyone saw the pattern differently, but all agreed that it existed and that it was leading somewhere darker. The preacher who traveled through the Hollow one October Sunday spoke of it in his sermon. He told the gathered crowd that the bloodshed was not random but sacrificial. Each death part of a ritual meant to curse the land or claim it for the devil. He pointed to the triangular mark as a sign of unholy trinity. An inversion of sacredness burned into the earth itself. He declared that the fields were cursed, that each body was another offering to a darkness that demanded more. His words sent shudders through the gathered families. Yet even those who scoffed at talk of demons could not shake the unease that something larger was at work. The pattern of the killings infected every part of daily life. Workers avoided certain rows where blood had been spilled, whispering that the soil was tainted. Children were told not to play near the fields lest the darkness claim them too. When lanterns were spotted swaying at night, no one dared follow for fear of becoming the next body marked and left behind. Even the sheriff who tried to insist the murders were the work of a gang or a single madman seemed unnerved. His deputies refused to patrol the Hollow after sunset, and he himself began to drink more heavily, his confidence eroded by the steady rhythm of death. What made the pattern most chilling was the sense of escalation. Each new killing carried a slight variation, as though building towards something greater. The wounds grew more elaborate, the displays more grotesque. With the hanged men discovered near the tree line, their mouths stuffed with cotton, the killing seemed to shout their message louder. No longer hidden in the rows, they now stood at the edge of the fields as though daring the community to see and to understand. The Hollow was no longer simply a place where people died. It had become a place where death was staged, repeated and woven into the very fabric of the land. By winter, even the skeptics admitted that something unnatural, or at least deeply organized, was unfolding. The killings had taken on the qualities of ritual, and ritual implied intent. But whose intent and to what end? That question poisoned the minds of everyone who remained in Black Hollow. Was it vengeance? Was it control? Or was it something older and darker that had always belonged to the land? The patterns of the murders suggested that the answer lay beyond the reach of any one explanation. Each death was a thread, weaving a tapestry of fear that grew more intricate and more suffocating with every passing week. And so the pattern held. As the cotton stalks withered in the winter cold, the memory of those deaths clung to the soil, the rhythm of the killings echoing in every whisper, every sight of a lantern swaying where no one should have been. The Hollow itself seemed to breathe with it, as though the land had accepted the ritual, absorbed it, and was waiting for the next act in a drama that no one could yet understand. As the bodies in Black Hollow began to mount, fear twisted itself into suspicion, and suspicion grew into accusation. It was inevitable. In a land already fractured by war, emancipation, and the uneasy machinery of Reconstruction, trust was a luxury no one could afford. Each new murder made neighbors look harder at one another. Eyes narrowed, hands lingering near rifles, words whispered behind doors. The victims came from different families, different backgrounds, and yet all had one thing in common. They lived and worked in the Hollow. That alone made the circle of suspects impossibly wide. And in a place where every man carried secrets and every woman feared for her children, blame could take root anywhere. For the white landowners, suspicion turned first toward the freedmen who labored in their fields. The idea was simple, almost too simple. These murders, they muttered, were acts of vengeance. Slavery may have been struck down by law, but in the minds of many it was still a fresh wound, and every cut left on the victims seemed to them a message that the old order was being avenged with blood. Stories spread of secret gatherings in the woods, of freedmen plotting by firelight to reclaim the land and drive out those who once held them in chains. No evidence was ever shown, no proof ever found, but in the heated whispers of plantation houses and town saloons, suspicion grew into certainty. The murders became a tool of fear, a way to argue that freedom had bred only savagery. The freedmen, for their part, looked upward in the social ladder, and their suspicion fell squarely on the landowners themselves. To them, the killings felt like punishment, a dark reminder that liberty was conditional and fragile. The strange triangular marks pressed into the dirt, the cotton stuffed into dead men's mouths. These were not random signs of cruelty. They looked like warnings, staged to remind freed families that the land was not theirs to claim, that every acre they worked still belonged to men who despised the very idea of their independence. Some spoke openly of the Ku Klux Klan, whose violence had already spread terror across other parts of the South. Men in hoods and robes might well be staging these killings, not only to destroy lives but to crush hope, using blood as their instrument of control. Poor white farmers, caught between these two groups, became suspects themselves. Desperate men, stripped of the pride they once carried as landholders or soldiers, were known to harbor resentment toward both freedmen and the wealthy planters who had abandoned them. The hollow was filled with such men, scratching out survival from rocky soil, nursing grudges as sharp as knives. Could the killings be the work of one of them? A man who had lost everything and turned his bitterness into ritualized slaughter? Some believed so. A drifter's lantern left behind, a tool pressed into the earth. These were things any man of the soil might carry. The notion was as plausible as it was terrifying, for it meant the killer might not be a stranger at all but someone who lived among them, someone whose face they passed in church or at the store. Rumors of outsiders only fanned the flames. Strangers riding into town were met with narrowed stares and questions that lingered too long. A peddler passing through was accused outright of carrying the devil's tools, his triangular iron stamps discovered among his wares. He was beaten, locked up and questioned for days before being released. No evidence tying him to the killings. By then, however, the damage was done. Every traveler who entered the hollow was treated with suspicion, every unknown face seen as a threat. The killings had poisoned not only the fields but the very notion of hospitality. The sheriff's inability to name a suspect only deepened the rift. Each faction believed he was protecting someone else. To the freedmen, his silence looked like complicity with the landowners. To the landowners, it reeked of cowardice, a refusal to confront what they insisted was a rising tide of black vengeance. To the poor whites, it smelled of betrayal, proof that lawmen cared more for those with money than for the common folk. No matter which way the sheriff turned, someone was convinced he was shielding the guilty, and in that climate, suspicion spread faster than cotton blight. Witnesses, too, added fuel to the fire. A woman swore she had seen a hooded figure carrying a lantern in the fields, the flame unnaturally still in the wind. A boy claimed to have found footprints larger than any man's near the site of a killing, prints that vanished mid-row, as though their maker had disappeared into thin air. A laborer insisted he had overheard two landowners speaking of keeping the workers in line, though what that meant was never clarified. None of these stories were confirmed, but each was repeated until it became part of the hollow's truth, reshaped by fear and prejudice. Every testimony seemed to point in a different direction, leaving only confusion and growing paranoia. The rituals of the killings, their strange symbols and eerie staging, only heightened suspicion. If the deaths had been mere robbery or drunken violence, the town might have found a scapegoat quickly. But the deliberate nature of the crime suggested something more calculating. People began to watch their neighbors more closely. A man sharpening his tools too late at night, a woman leaving her cabin after dark, a group gathering quietly in a barn. Innocent actions became sinister when seen through the lens of fear. The hollow became a place of watchers, Every eye scanning, every gesture weighed for hidden meaning. Even within families, suspicion crept. Brothers accused brothers, husbands questioned wives. A father whose son vanished for hours on a night when lanterns were spotted in the fields swore he would put a bullet in the boy himself if the truth turned against him. The murders had eroded the bonds that held the community together, leaving behind only the raw nerves of survival. By the time winter came, Black Hollow was less a community than a scattering of fearful souls bound together by mistrust. The suspicion that had taken root was not confined to race, class, or creed. It had spread everywhere, infecting every corner of life. Each group believed itself the potential victim and the likely target of blame. It was said that no one in the Hollow slept easily, not because they feared the killer in the fields, but because they feared the neighbor in the cabin next door. In such an atmosphere, the killings achieved what bullets alone could not. They divided, isolated, and hollowed out the very notion of community itself. It began with the lanterns. Long before the bodies piled high enough to break the town's spirit, there were stories of pale flames drifting through the rows of cotton at night. Workers claimed to see them from their cabins, small points of light, moving steadily as though carried in human hands, yet never accompanied by voices or the crunch of footsteps. Some swore they heard faint breathing carried on the wind or the faint rustle of cloth brushing stalks, as if someone or something was walking the fields unseen. A few brave men tried to follow the glow, but the lanterns always slipped away, vanishing into the mist as though swallowed by the land itself. When the bodies later appeared, each near a pool of lantern oil, it seemed less like coincidence and more like a ritual that had played out before their very eyes. The symbols pressed into the soil only deepened the unease. That triangular mark, stamped with precision as if made with a tool of iron, was found again and again. Some claimed it resembled the point of a plow or the blade of a branding iron. Objects familiar to life in Texas, but given here a grotesque new meaning. Others whispered that it had nothing to do with tools at all but belonged to a secret society, the kind of order that met in dark halls with oaths and torches, hidden from law and reason alike. Whatever its origin, it transformed each murder into more than death. It turned it into a message, and one no one could yet decipher. Stories soon began to emerge of figures seen moving through the cotton. Not men exactly, but silhouettes, tall, silent, too dark to be defined in the pale moonlight. Families sitting at cabin windows swore they saw them walking in slow, deliberate lines, never speaking, never turning their heads as though the fields belonged to them alone. One woman insisted she heard her name whispered from between the rows, though when she called back, no voice answered. A boy returning late from town claimed he saw 3 shapes kneeling in the dirt, hands pressed to the ground in a gesture like prayer, their lanterns glowing at their feet. When he blinked, the lights were gone and the field was empty. These sightings became part of the Hollow's folklore almost immediately, spreading faster than the sheriff's investigations could contain them. They were told in hushed voices by firelight, passed from worker to worker as warnings, as proof that what stalked the fields was more than human. To some, the lanterns and figures were the dead themselves, slaves who had perished on the land, their restless spirits seeking vengeance on both white and black alike. To others, they were living men, organized and disciplined, carrying out a campaign of terror under the cover of night, their secrecy more terrifying than any open gunfight. No one could say for certain, and in the absence of certainty, imagination fed the fear. The marks left behind at murder sites only added to the mystery. In addition to the triangular impressions, strange arrangements of footprints were sometimes found, circling the body in patterns that made no sense. They were too many for one man, but too few to suggest a crowd, and in more than one case the tracks ended abruptly, as though their makers had simply risen into the air. The preacher claimed these were signs of unholy rites, proof that each death was part of a ceremony designed to feed the soil with blood. The sheriff dismissed such claims, but even he could not explain why spilled oil, scorched patches of earth, and perfectly pressed shapes continued to appear, consistent from one killing to the next. Witnesses who dared to speak publicly found their words sharpened into weapons by others. A woman's claim that she saw a shadowed figure at her door one night was twisted into proof that the freedmen were conspiring. A man's story of a hooded rider carrying a lantern down the road was retold as evidence that former Confederates were punishing those who defied them. Even the boy who saw the kneeling figures became a target, accused of inventing his story to cover up mischief. The very act of seeing something in the hollow became dangerous, for it marked the speaker as either a fool or a conspirator, depending on who heard the tale. By late autumn, the sightings of lanterns grew more frequent, as though whatever haunted the hollow had grown bolder. Entire families described lying awake at night, watching pale lights drift across the horizon, sometimes 2 or 3 at once, bobbing gently in the dark. Some swore they saw them stop suddenly, hovering in one place for long minutes before fading away. Others said they seemed to move in deliberate routes, circling the fields like patrols as though guarding the land. The effect was devastating. No one dared step into the rows after sundown, and even the bravest men kept rifles by their doors, though no shot was ever fired. Fear, it seemed, was weapon enough. The most chilling account came from a traveling preacher who, one stormy night, sought shelter at a cabin near the hollow. He claimed that as the rain lashed against the roof, he looked out and saw 6 lanterns moving in formation across the field, their glow undisturbed by the wind or water. The figures carrying them were taller than any man, their movements slow and synchronized. They stopped as one, turned as one, and vanished all at once as if swallowed by the storm. When the preacher recounted this in his sermon, he called it a vision of damnation, proof that the hollow was under the grip of powers no mortal hand could break. His words struck terror into his flock, and though some dismissed him as fevered, others swore it explained everything: the killings, the symbols, the silence of justice. The hollow was claimed not by law or landowner, but by something far darker. From then on, the sightings of lanterns were no longer dismissed as imagination. They became part of the daily life of the hollow, an expectation rather than an exception. If one did not see them, someone else surely had, and the knowledge spread quickly. The cotton itself seemed to conspire with the fear, its pale bowls glimmering like ghostly lights in the moonlight, tricking the eyes, keeping people from sleep. Every flicker, every movement in the fields became a potential omen. And the more the sightings grew, the less anyone could separate rumor from truth. It was the unseen hand that terrified them most, not knowing if these were men cloaked in secrecy, spirits risen from the soil, or some combination of both. The lanterns swaying through the rows made the murders feel inevitable, part of a cycle playing out beyond human control. Each light was a reminder that the fields were watched, patrolled, owned by forces invisible yet inescapable. Whether those forces were the living or the dead mattered little. What mattered was that no one felt safe, and no one believed the hollow belonged to them anymore. The land had been claimed by shadows, and the blood spilled in its rows was only proof of what the lanterns already declared, that something unseen had taken hold, and it was not finished. By the winter of 1871, the weight of suspicion had settled over Black Hollow like a sickness no prayer could cure. Every whispered story, every unexplainable light, every body discovered with oil and symbols nearby seemed to demand an answer, and when no clear culprit emerged, the people of the hollow turned on one another. It began quietly, with sideways glances at Sunday service and strained silences in town, but soon grew into open accusations that cut deeper than any knife. Old grievances, once dulled by necessity, flared into fresh wounds when painted with the brush of the murders. Neighbors who had once worked side by side in the fields now regarded one another with narrowed eyes, seeing guilt in the smallest of gestures. The freedmen, already living under the constant shadow of prejudice, bore the heaviest burden. For some, it seemed impossible to believe that men who had only recently been unchained could resist the temptation to strike back at their former oppressors. Each rumor of shadowy figures moving through the cotton was laid at their feet, each lantern sighting twisted into proof of secret gatherings. Families who had done nothing but labor honestly and quietly found themselves the target of muttered slurs and veiled threats. Their cabins were sometimes marked with chalk, a silent warning that the town was watching, waiting for them to stumble. Yet among themselves they whispered a different story, that the killings were a warning to them as well, that someone meant to keep them bound by fear long after their chains were cut. White landowners fared little better in the swirl of suspicion. Rivalries between families, over acres of cotton, water rights, or debts owed since the war, suddenly became fertile ground for accusation. The McCraes swore that the Jessups had started the killings to drive away freedmen laborers and corner the market on cotton. The Jessups returned the favor by hinting that the McCraes had been spotted near the lantern lights one moonless night. Even prominent men of the church found themselves drawn into the net of doubt, with whispers that the very preacher who thundered against unholy rites might secretly be their master of ceremony. The sheriff, already mocked for his failure to find answers, faced accusations that he was covering for kin or complicit himself. His silence, born of frustration and fatigue, was read by many as proof. The killings seemed to feed off this atmosphere of mistrust, for each new body gave fresh fire to the rumors. When a man named Elias Crutchfield was found hanging from the frame of a half-built cotton press, his death was blamed first on freedmen seeking vengeance. When none came forward, tongues wagged that it must have been his rivals in town settling debts with blood. A week later, when a freedman named Isaiah was discovered with his throat cut beside the triangular mark, others declared it proof that whites were sending a message to those who dared claim freedom too boldly. Yet no matter how the blame shifted, the real hand behind the murders remained hidden, content to watch the hollow tear itself apart. Fear turned suspicion into something sharper, paranoia that twisted the mind until every creak of the cabin boards, every shadow cast by moonlight felt like an accusation. Families locked themselves inside at dusk, barring windows with planks, sitting in silence with rifles across their knees. Men who once rode together into town now traveled alone, avoiding the company of those they no longer trusted. Children were kept indoors after sundown, warned to ignore voices that called from outside, no matter how familiar they might sound. Some households even stopped going to Sunday service, convinced that the church itself had become a nest of liars and conspirators. The bonds that had once held Black Hollow together, however fragile, were unraveling one thread at a time. Rumors of secret meetings poisoned the town further. Some claimed that freedmen gathered at night in the forest, chanting hymns twisted into curses, their lanterns burning like the ones seen in the fields. Others swore that former Confederate officers, bitter and broken since Appomattox, had formed their own clandestine order to remind the Hollow who truly ruled it. Even the unexplained lanterns themselves became fuel for paranoia, proof, depending on who spoke, that one faction or another was planning the next strike. When the preacher thundered about dark rites hidden beneath the cover of night, the faces in his pews shifted uncomfortably, each man silently wondering whether his neighbor was among the guilty. The killings may have been spaced weeks apart, but suspicion made them feel constant, a slow bleed that never allowed the Hollow to heal. No sooner had one funeral ended than another body was found, and each time the symbols returned, marks in the dirt, oil pooled unnaturally, footprints circling like a ritual. The repetition only heightened the paranoia, for it suggested not a crime of passion but a deliberate campaign, a hand moving with patience and purpose. Every farmer, every worker, every preacher and lawman became a potential actor in that campaign, until trust itself seemed like the rarest commodity in the Hollow. What made the suspicion most dangerous was its refusal to rest. Even the smallest misstep could ignite it into flame. A man late returning home might be accused of wandering with a lantern. A woman who spoke too often of spirits might be accused of seeing more than she should. When one family abruptly left town after a killing, their departure was taken as proof of guilt, though no evidence was ever produced. The Hollow, it seemed, had reached a place where innocence could no longer be proven, only assumed by those lucky enough to escape the glare of rumor. The longer the murders went unsolved, the more suspicion itself became a weapon, wielded by those eager to settle old scores. Land disputes suddenly found resolution not in court, but in whispers that one family had been seen in the fields with strange lights. Debts were erased when the debtor vanished, leaving behind only a rumor that he had been taken for what he owed. Even marriages felt the strain, with wives questioning their husbands' late-night absences and husbands wondering whether their wives' confidences hid dangerous truths. No tie of blood or bond was strong enough to withstand the constant erosion of doubt. In that sense, the true horror of the Black Hollow murders may not have been the killings themselves, but what they left behind. The bodies could be buried, the fields replanted, the oil burned away by the sun, but suspicion lingered, seeping into every crack of the community until no one felt secure in the company of others. Neighbors became strangers, strangers became enemies, and even kinship proved fragile in the face of whispered blame. It was as though the Hollow itself had been cursed not by spirits or symbols, but by the corrosive power of mistrust. And long before the hand behind the killings was ever revealed, or, if it was revealed at all, the people of Black Hollow had already destroyed the thing that bound them together. their faith that the man beside them was not the enemy. By the spring of 1872, the hollow no longer spoke of justice with the conviction it once had. The word had become a hollow sound, something murmured at gravesides and muttered at the sheriff's desk, but few believed it would ever arrive. The murders, which began with the precision of ritual, had slowed, but the scars they carved into the land and its people remained raw and unhealed. Where once the promise of truth had carried the community forward, there was now only resignation, a quiet acceptance that some horrors would never be explained, and that the hollow itself was a place claimed by forces stronger than law or reason. Families who had lived on the land for generations began to leave, abandoning cotton that should have meant survival in lean times. Cabins were boarded up, fields left untended, and paths once beaten by wagons grew over with weeds. Those who remained found themselves surrounded by silence, broken only by the creak of shutters or the far-off cry of a whippoorwill. At night the lanterns were still seen, drifting faintly through the cotton rows, though no new bodies appeared beside them. Some took this as a blessing, a sign that the killings had finally ceased. Others feared it was a pause, a gathering of strength before the darkness claimed more lives. No one could agree, and so the lanterns became something worse than murder. They became an enduring presence, a reminder that the hollow could never fully be trusted. The preacher, once so fiery in his condemnations, grew quieter with each passing month. His sermons shifted from warnings of unholy rites to laments about suffering without reason, about the inscrutability of God's will. Where once he had pointed to sinners among them, now he cast his gaze upward, pleading for an answer that never came. His parishioners, weary from fear, found little comfort in his change. Some whispered that even he had been broken by the hollow, his certainty stripped away by the persistence of evil. Others wondered whether his retreat into vague sorrow was its own form of confession, a tacit admission that he had known more about the killings than he ever dared reveal. His silence became another ghost among many, haunting the church pews as surely as the lanterns haunted the fields. The sheriff fared no better. For a time he had thrown himself into the hunt for answers, chasing down rumors, interrogating neighbors, scouring the fields by day and night. But with each investigation that ended in confusion, his resolve crumbled. By the time spring came, his office door was often closed, his chair empty. Some claimed he was drinking himself to sleep in the back rooms, others that he had ridden west, unwilling to face the failure that clung to his name. Officially, he remained the law of Black Hollow, but in truth there was no law left to enforce. The murders had proven stronger than any badge or pistol, and the people no longer looked to him for protection. They looked only to their own doors, their own rifles, their own silence, and silence became the hollow's final inheritance. Neighbors no longer lingered in one another's company. Where once they had traded gossip at wells or in town, now they passed quickly, eyes averted as if speaking might draw the darkness closer. The freedmen who remained kept their gatherings small and subdued, wary of drawing attention, while the white landowners retreated into their own guarded circles. The community fractured into pieces that no longer touched, each one nursing its own wounds, its own suspicions. The hollow was no longer a town, but a collection of isolated families bound only by fear and memory. Children who grew up in that silence carried the stories forward, though never with certainty. They spoke of their parents' whispers about lantern lights, of strange marks in the soil, of figures glimpsed between the rows of cotton. Some believed the killers had been men of flesh and blood, driven by greed or hatred, protected by silence. Others were convinced the murders had been the work of restless spirits, punishing the living for sins buried too deep to name. With no truth ever revealed, both stories held equal weight, passed down like folklore until history and legend became indistinguishable. The hollow itself became a cautionary tale, a place spoken of in neighboring towns with shudders and sidelong glances. "Don't go there after dark," they warned. The lanterns still walk. The fields themselves seem to bear the memory of blood. Seasons came and went, but the cotton never grew as strong as it once had. Stalks wilted, bolls withered, and harvests yielded less than expected, no matter the care given. Some said the soil had been cursed, soured by the lives taken upon it. Others said it was simply neglect, the result of fear that kept farmers from tending the land with the devotion it required. Whatever the cause, the hollow never again returned to prosperity. Its very earth seemed to resist renewal, as if determined to keep the past alive. By the end of the decade, Black Hollow was a shadow of itself, a name that carried weight but little substance. Travelers spoke of boarded-up houses, of empty fields littered with weeds, of a church whose bell had long since gone silent. A few stubborn families clung to the land, unwilling to abandon the only home they had ever known, but even they lived more with memory than with hope. They spoke less of the murders as years passed, not because they had forgotten, but because the telling had grown too heavy, too bitter. Yet every so often, when a lantern was glimpsed in the distance, the stories returned, sharpened by the cold edge of remembrance. For those who studied the murders later, the case became a symbol of what happens when mystery festers without resolution. The killings themselves, brutal as they were, did not destroy the Hollow as thoroughly as the silence that followed. The refusal, or the inability to name the guilty, left space for every rumor to grow unchecked, for every suspicion to rot into paranoia. In the end, truth mattered less than the belief that it could never be found, and it was that belief that hollowed out the town as surely as any blade. Scholars debated whether the murders had been the work of vigilantes, secret societies, or something stranger still. But the people who lived there knew better. It was not the hand that struck the blows, but the silence that followed them that killed Black Hollow. And so the Hollow endured, not as a community but as a memory, carried in whispers and warnings, in ghost stories told by candlelight. The lanterns that had once heralded death became symbols of something larger, something that outlasted the killers themselves. They were the embodiment of fear without answer, of questions left forever unresolved. For some, they were reminders of the dead crying out for justice. For others, they were proof that evil could linger in a place long after the deeds were done. Either way, they ensured that the Hollow would never be forgotten. Its cotton fields, its cabins, its church and sheriff's office all faded in time. But the lanterns, the silence, and the uncertainty lived on, drifting endlessly through the night like lights no storm could extinguish. What you've just heard is not only a story of murder, but a story of silence, of lanterns that wandered through the cotton fields of Texas in a community that could never decide if it was men or something darker, that claimed the lives of their neighbors. Black Hollow was more than a place on a map. It was a wound in the land, one that never healed because no one dared to name the truth. And perhaps that is the greatest horror of all, when the dead are buried but the questions remain. So now I turn that silence over to you. Do you believe the killers were flesh and blood hidden by secrecy and fear? Or do you think the Hollow's lanterns carried something far older, something that belonged to the shadows of the earth itself? The story ends without answers, but your reflections, your theories, are part of keeping the memory alive. Share them in the comments below. Let your voice become part of this conversation that history itself refused to finish. If you want to continue walking these haunted roads of the past with us, where truth is uncertain, and history is as chilling as any ghost story, make sure you subscribe. Every episode will take you deeper into the dark corners of forgotten America, into mysteries that still echo through the soil, because sometimes the most terrifying question is not who killed, but why the truth was left to die alongside them. Subscribe, comment, and ask yourself, what still walks in the hollow tonight?